On the morning of May 20th, 1967, Stefan Michalak drove into the wilderness around Falcon Lake, Manitoba, with nothing more ambitious in mind than searching for quartz veins and precious metals. A Polish immigrant and amateur geologist, Michalak had spent years exploring the Canadian Shield, armed with basic prospecting tools and an unshakable belief that the ancient rock formations might yield valuable minerals. What happened to him that afternoon would become one of the most thoroughly documented and investigated UFO cases in Canadian history. A case that, nearly 60 years later, continues to defy simple explanation. Unlike the typical UFO report filled with vague descriptions and questionable testimony, the Falcon Lake incident produced physical evidence that investigators could measure, photograph, and analyze. Michalak emerged with burns on his chest and abdomen, trace radioactivity that triggered official testing and debate, and a story that remained consistent in its core elements through decades of scrutiny. The Canadian government and military conducted a multi-agency inquiry, RCMP, RCAF, the National Research Council and the Department of Health, producing unusually extensive files for a UFO case in Canada. Welcome to Vanishing Threads. Today we're exploring the Falcon Lake incident, not just as a UFO encounter, but as a case study in how physical evidence, government transparency, and decades of investigation can transform a single witness account into one of the most credible unexplained events in modern history. We'll examine the documented medical evidence, the government files released through Freedom of Information requests, and the scientific analysis that has kept this case alive in the minds of researchers for more than half a century. Stefan Michalak was 51 years old in 1967, a machinist by trade who had immigrated to Canada from Poland in 1949 with his wife and young son. Like many immigrants of his generation, he worked hard to establish himself in his new country, eventually settling in Winnipeg, where he found steady employment. But Michalak's passion lay in geology and prospecting, a hobby that took him regularly into the vast wilderness of the Canadian Shield, searching for mineral deposits and interesting rock formations. The Whiteshell Provincial Park area around Falcon Lake, roughly 150 kilometers east of Winnipeg, had become one of Michalak's favorite prospecting locations. The region's ancient Precambrian rock formations, some of the oldest on Earth, often contained quartz veins that could harbor precious metals. Michalak had already staked several claims in the area and had found promising mineral samples on previous expeditions. On the Victoria Day long weekend of 1967, Michalak decided to spend the holiday exploring a particular quartz vein he had discovered near Falcon Lake. He drove out early on that Saturday morning, the 20th of May, parked his car along the Trans-Canada Highway and hiked approximately 2 kilometers into the forest to reach his prospecting site. The morning passed uneventfully. Michalak worked methodically, chipping away at the quartz formation with his geological hammer, examining samples and making notes. Around noon, he stopped for lunch, coffee from a thermos and sandwiches his wife had prepared. The forest was quiet, interrupted only by the occasional bird call and the sound of his own work. It was around 1:15 p.m. when something extraordinary happened. According to Michalak's account, which he would repeat consistently for the rest of his life, he first heard the cackling of geese, the agitated sounds birds make when startled by something unusual. Looking up from his work, he saw what appeared to be 2 glowing disc-shaped objects descending from the sky. They were red-hot in color, gradually cooling to a silvery metallic appearance as they approached the ground. One object landed approximately 160 feet from where Michalak was working, whilst the other hovered briefly before departing back into the sky. The exact time of this encounter has been reported variously. Michalak himself placed it around 1:15 p.m., whilst some contemporary police records indicate he flagged down highway patrol at approximately 3 p.m., suggesting the encounter may have occurred somewhat earlier in the afternoon. The landed craft, which Michalak estimated to be about 35 feet in diameter and 10 feet high, sat motionless for what seemed like several minutes. During this time, Michalak claimed he could hear voices coming from inside the object. Human voices, speaking in what sounded like English, though he couldn't make out the words clearly. Michalak, a naturally curious man, decided to approach the craft. As he drew nearer, he noticed that what he had initially taken for voices were actually more like mechanical sounds, perhaps ventilation systems or equipment operating inside the object. The craft appeared to be made of a highly polished metallic material that was almost mirror-like in its reflection. When Michalak got within arm's reach of the object, he discovered what appeared to be an opening or door. Through this aperture, he could see a maze of lights and what looked like instrument panels. The interior appeared to be brightly illuminated, though he couldn't see anyone inside despite the sounds he continued to hear. Being a practical man, Michalak attempted to communicate with whoever might be operating the craft. He called out greetings in English, then tried Russian, German, French, Italian, and finally Ukrainian, all languages he knew to some degree. When he received no response, he decided to examine the craft more closely. The exterior surface was smooth and warm to the touch. Michalak noticed that his rubber gloves began to melt slightly when he placed his hands on the craft, and his steel watch became magnetized. The object appeared to be some form of advanced aircraft, though unlike anything in his experience or knowledge. After approximately 30 minutes of observation and attempted communication, the craft suddenly began to move. As it started to rise, Michalak was caught off guard and found himself standing directly in front of what appeared to be an exhaust vent or propulsion system. A rush of hot gases struck him in the chest, and he was knocked backwards by the force. The pain was immediate and severe. Michalak's shirt caught fire, and he quickly tore it off, stamping on the flames to extinguish them. The craft rose silently and departed, leaving him alone in the forest with severe burns across his chest and upper abdomen. The distinctive smell of sulfur filled the air, a smell that would linger on his body for weeks. Despite the pain and shock, Michalak managed to mark the location where the craft had landed and began the difficult journey back to his car. The walk, which had taken him about 30 minutes that morning, now took nearly 2 hours as he struggled with pain, nausea, and disorientation. When Michalak finally reached his car, he was in considerable distress. The burns on his chest were severe, and he was experiencing symptoms that would later be diagnosed as consistent with radiation exposure: nausea, vomiting, and severe weakness. He drove himself to the nearest town, Kenora, Ontario, where he sought medical attention at a small hospital. The medical staff at Kenora Hospital were puzzled by Michalak's condition and his account of how he had been injured. The burns on his chest and abdomen formed a distinctive grid pattern, as if he had been burned through a grated screen or vent. The pattern was too regular and precise to be accidental, yet unlike anything the medical staff had seen before. Due to the unusual nature of his injuries and his story, Michalak was referred to the Misericordia Health Center in Winnipeg for more comprehensive treatment. There, physicians documented his condition in detail, creating medical records that would become crucial evidence in the subsequent investigation. The medical documentation from Misericordia Hospital provides some of the most compelling and contested evidence in the entire case. Dr. Horace Dudley, the attending physician, noted several round and irregular-shaped burns across Michalak's upper chest and abdomen, each roughly the size of a silver dollar. The burns were first degree, but their pattern was unlike anything in medical literature at that time. Most significantly, Michalak had lost 13 pounds within 3 days of the incident, a dramatic weight loss that continued over the following weeks. He complained of persistent nausea, vomiting, severe headaches, and a metallic taste in his mouth that wouldn't go away. For weeks after the encounter, his body emitted a strange sulfuric odor that was noticeable to his family and medical staff. Blood tests were conducted to check for radiation exposure, though the results were somewhat inconclusive due to the limited testing capabilities available in 1967. However, Michalak's symptoms, including the rapid weight loss, nausea, vomiting, and general malaise, were consistent with radiation poisoning, even if they couldn't definitively prove it. Perhaps most remarkably, and most controversially, photographs of Michalak's chest taken at different times show evolving patterns. Early medical records and photos from May 1967 show irregular, round-shaped burns. Later photographs, taken in late 1967 and January 1968, show a different, grid-like lesion pattern that prompted further skeptical comment. A Mayo Clinic psychiatrist who examined these later photographs described some of the lesions as obviously factitious, that is, possibly self-inflicted or produced, though he did not diagnose Michalak with major mental illness. Medical experts consulted at the time offered conflicting interpretations, with some unable to explain the phenomenon, whilst others raised questions about the nature and origin of the later lesions. The case attracted the attention of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police almost immediately. RCMP officers, including Constable G.A. Solotki, who was flagged down by Michalak on the highway, began the process of documenting his account and investigating the incident. Various RCMP investigators conducted interviews and examined evidence over the following months, approaching the case with professional skepticism but thorough methodology. Initially, there was a problem. Michalak couldn't relocate the exact spot where the encounter had occurred. During his first attempt to guide investigators to the site, he became disoriented and couldn't find the distinctive quartz formation where he had been working. This inability to find the location immediately raised suspicions among investigators and gave credence to those who doubted his story. However, several weeks later, Michalak returned to the area with a friend and successfully located the site. What they found there provided additional physical evidence that corroborated his account. At the alleged landing site, investigators discovered a semicircular area where the ground vegetation had been burned away. The burned area formed a perfect semicircle, roughly 15 feet in diameter, with the soil underneath showing signs of extreme heat exposure. Some soil and fragment samples tested as showing trace radioactivity in laboratory tests. Subsequent analysts cautioned that the levels were low and could be due to natural radium content or contamination. For example, luminescent radium paint. More intriguingly, investigators found small fragments of metal scattered around the site, some wedged into cracks in the rock where the craft had allegedly hovered. Peter Millman of the National Research Council analyzed samples and described the material as commercial-grade silver, approximately 93 to 96% silver, with slight radioactivity. Millman noted in his memo that the fragments looked like refined commercial silver and suggested they may have been contaminated with radioactive material. Later analysts have argued both for and against a conventional origin for these materials, and the fragments' exact source and purpose remain disputed. The radioactive readings at the site were confirmed by multiple independent tests conducted by different agencies. While the levels weren't dangerously high, they were anomalous for the natural background radiation in the area. No satisfactory explanation was ever provided for why this particular location would show elevated radiation levels if nothing unusual had occurred there. The Canadian government's response to the Falcon Lake incident was remarkably thorough, involving multiple agencies including the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Air Force (RCAF), the National Research Council, where Dr. Peter Millman coordinated scientific investigation, and the Department of National Health and Welfare. However, the investigation's conclusions were more nuanced than often portrayed. Dr. Peter Millman, a respected astronomer at the National Research Council, approached the case with appropriate scientific skepticism. His team conducted extensive interviews with Michalak, examined medical records, and analyzed soil and metal samples from the site. The RCAF search teams and other investigators flagged some inconsistencies in Michalak's account, particularly his initial difficulty relocating the site, and some raised concerns about possible contamination or other conventional explanations. The official investigators produced a cautious, well-documented record. They found no definitive conventional explanation, and some tests did return anomalous results. Yet investigators also noted inconsistencies and raised skeptical possibilities, including concerns about contamination and questions about the later medical evidence. The case was neither proved to be a hoax nor definitively explained, and the government files remain ambiguous. Some officials even considered alternative theories involving accidental exposure to radioactive materials or other prosaic explanations. In the decades since the incident, the Falcon Lake case has been subjected to continuous scrutiny and re-examination. A relatively high level of official documentation exists, with many files now held at Library and Archives Canada and released through Freedom of Information requests. Whilst the Canadian government's handling of the case was more open than many UFO investigations of the era, some government memos remained cautious or withheld from public release for periods of time, and media pressure and public outcry influenced the eventual release of documents. The medical evidence remains particularly complex and subject to differing interpretations. Dr. Roy Craig, who investigated the case for the University of Colorado UFO project, the Condon Committee, examined Michalak's medical records and interviewed his physicians. Craig and the Condon Committee approached the case with considerable skepticism and, whilst they examined the evidence thoroughly, they remained unconvinced of an extraordinary explanation. The committee's final report did not endorse the encounter as evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. The burn pattern on Michalak's chest, particularly the later grid-like lesions photographed in late 1967 and January 1968, has been analysed by numerous medical experts over the years. Whilst the initial burns documented immediately after the incident were irregular and consistent with some form of thermal injury, the later, more uniform grid pattern raised questions. The Mayo Clinic psychiatrist's assessment that some lesions appeared factitious has been cited by skeptics as evidence that the case may not be as straightforward as it appears. However, supporters of Michalak's account note that the initial injuries and his immediate symptoms remain difficult to explain through conventional means. Modern analysis of the metal fragments found at the site has provided additional questions rather than definitive answers. Analyses of metal fragments over the years found material described by some examiners as mostly silver with slight radioactivity. Peter Millman and other analysts suggested that contamination, for example, from radium-based paint or other radioactive materials, could provide a plausible conventional explanation. Later commentators have argued both for and against a conventional origin, with some researchers maintaining that the fragments remain unexplained, while skeptics point to Millman's contamination hypothesis as a reasonable alternative. The radiation readings from the site have been re-examined using more sophisticated equipment than was available in 1967. While some elevated readings were detected, questions have been raised about natural background radiation in the White Shell region, where local geology contains higher natural radioactivity in places. Some investigators have suggested that the readings could be explained by natural radium deposits in the rock, though comprehensive geological surveys have produced ambiguous results that satisfy neither skeptics nor believers. Stefan Michalak's credibility as a witness has been examined exhaustively over the years. He was subjected to psychological evaluation, polygraph tests, and countless interviews by investigators, journalists, and researchers. Throughout this scrutiny, his story remained absolutely consistent. He never sought financial gain from his experience, never wrote a book, or sought celebrity, and consistently deflected attention rather than courting it. Michalak's background also supported his credibility. As a Polish immigrant who had experienced German occupation during World War II, he was naturally suspicious of authority and had no reason to invite government attention. His son Stan has noted that his father's generation of Polish immigrants typically avoided any interaction with authorities, making it highly unlikely that he would fabricate a story that would result in extensive government investigation. The case has been featured in numerous documentaries, books, and academic studies. In 2017, on the 50th anniversary of the incident, it received renewed attention when the Royal Canadian Mint issued a commemorative coin featuring the Falcon Lake encounter, an unusual honor for a UFO case and perhaps a tacit acknowledgement of its cultural significance in Canadian history, though the Mint's decision to commemorate the event does not constitute scientific validation. The University of Manitoba now houses one of the world's most comprehensive collections of UFO-related documents, donated by researcher Chris Rutkowski. The Falcon Lake case files are among the most extensively documented in this collection, providing researchers with access to thousands of pages of government documents, medical records, and scientific analysis. Modern UFO researchers continue to cite the Falcon Lake case as one of the most credible on record. Unlike many UFO encounters that rely solely on eyewitness testimony, this case produced multiple forms of physical evidence that have been preserved and can be re-examined as new analytical techniques become available. The case has also influenced how governments approach UFO investigations. The Canadian government's relatively transparent handling of the Falcon Lake case contrasts sharply with the secretive approaches often taken by other nations. This transparency has allowed researchers to understand not just what happened, but how authorities investigated and reached their conclusions. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who served as the U.S. Air Force's scientific consultant on UFO investigations, examined the Falcon Lake case and included it in his classification system as a close encounter of the second kind, a UFO event that produces physical effects. Hynek considered it one of the most compelling cases in his files. The incident has also been studied from psychological and sociological perspectives. Researchers have examined why some UFO cases gain credibility whilst others are dismissed. And the Falcon Lake case is often cited as an example of how physical evidence, witness credibility, and thorough investigation can combine to create a compelling, unexplained event. What sets the Falcon Lake case apart from many other UFO encounters is not that it provides definitive proof of anything, but rather that it remains stubbornly ambiguous despite thorough investigation. Over nearly 60 years, investigators have proposed various conventional explanations: contamination with radioactive materials, accidental exposure, psychosomatic symptoms, and even deliberate fabrication. Yet none of these alternatives fully accounts for all the documented evidence. The medical records, radiation readings, however disputed, metal fragments and ground traces all point to some form of unusual event, even if we can't definitively identify what that event was. The case also demonstrates the importance of proper investigation and documentation. Because the Canadian authorities took Michalak's account seriously and conducted a thorough investigation, we have a comprehensive record of evidence that can be re-examined as our analytical capabilities improve. This stands in contrast to many UFO cases where evidence was either ignored or inadequately documented. Stefan Michalak lived with the consequences of his encounter for the rest of his life. The burns eventually healed, but he continued to experience health problems that he attributed to the incident. He never fully regained the weight he lost immediately after the encounter, and he suffered from periodic blackouts and other symptoms that his doctors couldn't fully explain. Despite the ongoing health effects and the skepticism he often faced, Michalak never wavered from his account of what happened that day. He granted occasional interviews to researchers and journalists, but generally preferred to avoid publicity. His consistency in retelling the story, combined with his obvious reluctance to discuss it, added to his credibility as a witness. When Michalak died in 1999, he had lived with the mystery of his encounter for 32 years. His son Stan has continued to support his father's account and has worked with researchers to ensure that the evidence from the case remains available for future investigation. The Falcon Lake incident continues to be studied and debated today. New analytical techniques have been applied to the physical evidence, and researchers continue to search for conventional explanations that could account for all the documented effects. So far, no such explanation has been found. The case has also influenced how UFO researchers approach their investigations. The thorough documentation and preservation of evidence in the Falcon Lake case has become a model for how such events should be investigated and recorded. The transparency of the government investigation has demonstrated that official involvement in UFO cases doesn't necessarily mean cover-up or denial. For modern UFO researchers, the Falcon Lake case represents something of a gold standard, a well-documented, thoroughly investigated encounter with extensive physical evidence and credible witnesses. Whether or not one believes Michalak encountered an extraterrestrial craft, the case demonstrates that some UFO reports deserve serious scientific investigation rather than automatic dismissal. The Canadian government's files on the case remain available to researchers, and new documents occasionally surface as additional materials are declassified or donated to archives. This ongoing availability of primary source materials ensures that future researchers will be able to re-examine the evidence as new analytical techniques are developed. Perhaps most importantly, the Falcon Lake case demonstrates that extraordinary claims can be investigated scientifically and objectively. The Canadian authorities didn't endorse Michalak's interpretation of events, but they took his evidence seriously and conducted a thorough investigation. Their conclusion, that something genuinely unusual had occurred, even if they couldn't explain what, represents a model of how scientific institutions should approach unexplained phenomena. As we continue to grapple with questions about UFOs and unexplained aerial phenomena, the Falcon Lake case remains relevant not just for its evidence, but for its methodology. It shows us how such cases should be investigated, documented, and preserved for future analysis. Today, more than 57 years after Stefan Michalak emerged from the Manitoba forest with his inexplicable burns and his extraordinary story, the Falcon Lake incident remains Canada's most credible UFO case. It serves as a reminder that our understanding of the world around us is still incomplete, and that sometimes the most extraordinary claims come backed by the most compelling evidence. What endures about Falcon Lake isn't simply the grid pattern burns or the radioactive fragments. It's the unsettling fact that, after decades of investigation, the evidence has refused to yield a conventional explanation. Michalak's story stands as both a warning and an invitation, a warning that the unknown can leave marks we can't ignore, and an invitation to keep asking questions even when the answers remain out of reach. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Falcon Lake, not a solved mystery, but an enduring challenge. How do we reconcile an event that defies both belief and dismissal? And if the most credible case in Canadian history still leaves us searching, what other mysteries might be waiting in the wilderness, beyond the edges of what we think we know? Thanks for tuning in, and remember, stay curious, stay safe.